Today we're getting into a story that's just wild. It's about the music that sounds like pure sunshine, the Beach Boys, and the genius behind it all, Brian Wilson. A story that's as tragic as it is beautiful.
So here's the thing that just gets me. What if the happiest, sunniest music you've ever heard was actually created by one of pop's most tragic figures? I mean, think about it. The Beach Boys are the sound of an endless summer, right? But the guy who wrote it all, he was living in a much, much darker world. Let's dig into that.
Yeah, the image of the Beach Boys was just so perfect, right? All-American, sun, surfing, fast cars. But the reality, the guy writing the songs, Brian Wilson, was this studio genius who was actually terrified of the water. He didn't care about the surf culture he was basically creating the soundtrack for. He wasn't the dude on the surfboard. He was the quiet architect, locked away in a room, building this incredible ocean of pure sound.
So how did he become this architect of sound? Well, it all kicked off when he took total control of everything, turning the recording studio into his own personal instrument.
This was the turning point, really. The rest of the band is out on the road, playing shows, and Brian has this massive panic attack on a plane in 1965. And right then, he makes his huge decision: no more touring. He was going to stay home and just create. He would dedicate every ounce of his energy to writing and producing. And this isolation, well, it was the key to his greatest work, but it also, sadly, set the stage for his eventual breakdown.
Okay, so now he's free from the road, and Brian's ambition just explodes. The very first thing he does in this new phase, he creates an album that would change pop music forever. Of course, I'm talking about the legendary Pet Sounds.
And you have to understand, the leap he took here was just staggering. This was not just another album of catchy tunes about cars and girls. No way. Brian was completely leaving behind those simple rock and roll formulas. He was trying to create something deeply personal, incredibly vulnerable, and musically so complex.
And his approach was just wild. Forget your standard guitars and drums. Brian was using the studio to build what he called a wall of sound. It's this dense orchestral technique where you just layer instrument on top of instrument to create one single massive sound. He was bringing in French horns, the spooky wobble of a theremin, that electronic thing you play without touching it. He even used bicycle bells and barking dogs. And he mixed all of that with these sophisticated jazz chords that you just did not hear in a pop song back then. He wasn't just recording music, it felt like he was painting with sound.
But not everyone got it, not by a long shot. When the rest of the band came back from touring to lay down vocals, they were just baffled. And this quote from Brian's cousin and bandmate Mike Love just says it all. Who's going to hear this? The ears of a dog? It perfectly captures that tension. Brian was reaching for the heavens, but to some of his own bandmates, it just sounded, well, weird. And you can start to see the first cracks forming right there. So, if Pet Sounds was the masterpiece, what came next was supposed to be the magnum opus, the big one. But Brian's obsessive quest for perfection would end up pushing him and his music right over the edge. He called his next project Smile, and he described it as a teenage symphony to God. And look, that wasn't just a cool album title, that was his mission. He genuinely believed he could create a piece of music so profound, so perfect, it would be a spiritual experience for teenagers everywhere. The ambition was just off the charts, maybe even impossible.
So to pull off this symphony, he literally invented a whole new way of working. It's called modular recording. Instead of recording songs from start to finish, he'd record thousands of tiny little musical pieces. A few seconds of a bass line here, a little vocal harmony there. The plan was to stitch them all together later, like a giant musical jigsaw puzzle.
But here's the thing you have to remember. This is decades before computers and digital editing. He was doing this with actual tape and a razor blade. He ended up with a literal mountain of unlabeled tape snippets with no clear map of how they all fit together. The very process that was supposed to create perfection, it just became total chaos. He was getting buried under the weight of his own creation.
And as this musical puzzle got more and more complex, Brian's behavior got more and more erratic. That line between being an eccentric genius and someone in real trouble was getting really blurry. A sandbox in your living room with a piano in it, that's quirky, I guess. But believing the music you're making is so powerful that it's actually causing fires across the city, that's not quirky. That's paranoia. He was really starting to lose his grip.
And while all this is happening, while Brian's wrestling with his symphony, there's another huge pressure building, his rivalry with the Beatles.
It was like this creative duel across the Atlantic, with each band trying to one-up the other. But then, when Brian heard Sgt. Pepper's, he was absolutely devastated. In his mind, they had done it. They had achieved everything he was desperately trying to do with Smile. And for him, that was the final blow. He felt like he'd been beaten to the summit.
And so, crushed by all the pressure, his own deteriorating mental health, and this feeling of utter defeat, he did the unthinkable. He just walked away. His teenage symphony to God was locked away in a vault. And just like that, it became the most famous lost album in the history of music.
For decades, that's where the story ended. Just a tragic tale of a genius who flew too close to the sun. But the final chapter hadn't been written yet. 37. Just let that sink in. For 37 years, this masterpiece was a myth. It was a ghost in the machine of pop music, something you only heard on bootlegs or in whispers among hardcore fans. An entire lifetime went by.
And then, in 2004, the impossible happened. After years and years of therapy, with the support of a whole new band, Brian Wilson, along with his original lyricist Van Dyke Parks, went back to that mountain of tapes, and he finally solved the puzzle. The first time he performed it live, people were met with tears and standing ovations. It was this incredible moment of redemption.
When you look at it, Brian's story is really one of profound fragility, but also even greater resilience. Here's a composer who could literally hear the infinite possibilities of sound, but whose own spirit was almost completely broken just trying to capture them.
And that leaves us with this one big, powerful question, doesn't it? Brian Wilson's music is the sound of pure joy, but it was forged in so much personal pain. It really makes you wonder, how much of great art is born not just from genius, but from the struggle against our own deepest fears? Is the greatest art just an expression of talent, or is it really a victory over the very demons that threaten to silence us?